Hello, everyone, and thank you, Caitlin. If you're surprised to see me, I'm surprised to be here too, because we were hoping Martin could join us, but he dodged Hurricane Eta, but the tail caught his internet connection. So here we are with the one and only Brad Feld. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Nasir. Nice to see you as substitute Martin.
Well, we've been doing this tag team effort through UVC for 10 years now, and it's been an incredible journey building out this ecosystem and looking at ways in which we can continue to evolve and better connect our region. Today is just one more example where we made a late decision to go all online and host the conference, and we've got 500 people registered. This online experience has really proved successful. So looks like, it's just another opportunity for us to come together. Welcome. You really need no introduction, but I have to say that when Martin and I first started talking in January of 2009, our very first conversation was around my talking about how I was tracking what Techstars was doing. And he said, well, in that case, you have to meet Brad. And the next year we showed up in Boulder, and the thing that I was most excited about was to get a look in your office at the walking treadmill you had with your laptop on it. And since then, there's been so much with Up Global and the Startup America partnership, how Techstars has evolved and what the two Davids have done with it. The Startup Community book has really been influential in so many ways in getting our, team here in Upstate organized and oriented. So we're thrilled that you've come out with the follow-up now, and love to dive in a little bit into the Startup Community way. But for those who may not have read the first book, would you do a brief recap of the 4 key principles of the Boulder Thesis?
Sure. So Startup Communities came out in 2012. I started writing it in 2010. And we were just starting to talk about coming out of the global financial crisis as a society. And so really, when the book came out in 2012, the principles of the Boulder Thesis, there are, again, 4 of them, were at the time very non-obvious. Today, I think they're pretty obvious, which is good. It's also important to know that the phrase startup communities didn't exist when I wrote the book. So really, I was trying to create a construct which 8 years later, I think broadly around startup communities, entrepreneurial ecosystems, which are different things, and entrepreneurship and innovation broadly sort of really locked in. But the timing is important, like that notion that we were just coming out of this global financial crisis that led to these 4 principles. The first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. The second is that you have to take a long-term view, at least 20 years. The third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community at any level. And the fourth is that you have to have activities and events for everyone in the entrepreneurial stack to engage in entrepreneurship. So not just cocktail parties, not just entrepreneurship of the year awards, but accelerators, startup weekends, real engagement around entrepreneurship. So at the time, that challenged a lot of norms, especially in communities that historically had and today have a strong university, large corporations, government engagement, service providers playing a key role. And all of these actors, all of these organizations are important in the context of the startup community. But what I've done sort of more recently is really help separate the definition of a startup community from an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And the important point there to end on with the Boulder Thesis is that there is only one goal of a startup community, has one goal and one goal only, which is to help entrepreneurs succeed.
Yeah.
That's the core, the nucleus of the activity. The entrepreneurial ecosystem is a bigger container, and all of the actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, which again includes university, government, nonprofits supporting entrepreneurship, large corporations, service providers, they all have multiple goals, with one of them being to help entrepreneurs succeed. And so it allows us collectively to focus on that startup community activity around that one goal, while still having all of those different organizations engage productively around both the startup community and the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Yeah, fabulous. So I have to admit, I got a chuckle out of reading the book, because in the early 90s, I would go to Santa Fe to get papers from the institute there on chaos theory and all of these things. That complex adaptive systems are not what I would have picked as the the ideal way to explain this, but there are so many things that fit. Do you mind just sharing why you chose this particular way of explaining the somewhat chaotic and complex nature of ecosystems and communities?
Yeah, so just to underscore the question for those that haven't read the book, the new book, The Startup Community Way, is built on the construct of a startup community is a complex adaptive system. And we shortened it to complex system because it's just too ponderous to say complex adaptive system over and over again. And a complex adaptive system is just a subset of a complex system. Nasir's linkage is to the Santa Fe Institute, which was created in the 80s and really pioneered complexity theory. And it was also a fascination of mine in the early 1990s. I remember reading a book called Complexity by Mitchell Walter, one of the very early books around this, and it talked about Brian Arthur and increasing returns and sort of many constructs that I think most people in entrepreneurship use and think about on a regular basis, but don't necessarily have the words for it. The way we landed on using complex systems as the fundamental approach in this book, my co-author Ian Hathaway and I actually wrote the book in 2017. And about a year later, in 2018, we were basically done, but we felt like the book sucked. We felt like it wasn't interesting, it wasn't engaging, it wasn't a worthy sequel to Startup Communities, which really was, a book that was very powerful and had a lot of response. And we were struggling because we had a lot of good stuff in it, but there was just nothing that held it together. Ian came up with the notion that a startup community is a complex adaptive system, which I'll define in a sec so everybody has the language right. So then we built the book around the idea of complex systems and startup communities being a complex system. We finished the book in the summer of 2019, sent it out to about 30 early readers, and it came back with the feedback of tons of interesting stuff in here. No one's going to get past chapter 3. And we'd organize, and that was consistent feedback. And what we did was we sort of started talking, about startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems. Then we had 2 or 3 chapters on complexity theory, and then we applied it. And everybody said, it's just like a wall. It's too hard. So we took the book, and for anybody that does software development and knows agile software development, we effectively refactored the book. We broke the book up into 100 pieces. We took the language from complexity theory that was interesting to us. So words like contagion, which we all are very familiar with today because of COVID, positive feedback loops, phase transformation, nonlinear systems, things like that. And we built sort of a matrix of chapters down on rows and across the top concepts. And we plugged 100 pieces in. And we basically took this notion of complex systems and just used the language with some understanding of the language, but across how startup communities work. So that's the essence of the book. I want to define really quickly for people who say, that's great, Brad and Nasir, but what's a complex adaptive system? I'm going to define it with an example of 3 types of systems: simple, complicated, and complex. Simple system is making a cup of coffee. You put beans and water in, you run them through a machine, you get coffee out. There's a recipe, beginning, end, deterministic outcome. You can modify some things, put sugar in or different beans. Might not be good coffee, but you got coffee coming out. That's a simple system. A complicated system is doing your monthly financial statements. Lots more steps, lots more inputs, different order, but there's still a playbook or a recipe and a deterministic outcome at the end of the month. When you print your financial statements, you have a balance sheet, cash flow statement, and income statement. Month after month, deterministic outcome. A complex system is raising a child. We've all been children, or we've all raised children. And if when that child is born, you try to apply a recipe or a playbook to that child and say at 25 years old, they're going to like this kind of sport, they're going to eat this kind of food, they're going to have gone to this kind of school, they're going to be interested in this kind of thing, they're going to be in this kind of relationship, they're going to live, like all you're doing is setting that child up for tons and tons of therapy. It's a complex system. Your inputs generate outputs that become inputs, and it's constantly changing, modifying, evolving. You can't determine this. You don't have this deterministic outcome where if you do A, B, C, then D happens. And that's a startup community. It's a complex system. It's constantly changing. And again, just to end on this notion, our goal is not with the book is not to teach people complexity theory. It's to apply language from complexity theory to how startup communities grow, develop, and evolve, so that all of us in the entrepreneurial ecosystem have a much crisper way of talking about what's happening and what we're doing and how it's changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that Martin and I were discussing the other day. So, one is, there are lots of different actors, and as you create the distinction between the startup community and the ecosystem, where the ecosystem is made up of entities and organizations that have their own priorities and their own objectives in terms of the trajectory that they want to go to. How is it that, what are the factors that can accelerate or constrain the ability of entrepreneurs in such a community, given the impact that the ecosystem might have on it? And where you have seen situations, so, one of the things I noticed when I moved to upstate New York was just how hierarchical everything was. And one of the books that I learned it from is one of the books you talked about, which is Annalise Exenian's book, right, on the comparison between Silicon Valley and Route 128. And so what have you seen over these last few years in terms of what communities have been able to do to, change that or to succeed against those types of headwinds where there's enormous top-down pressure?
Well, that's 2 hours worth of questions to answer. Let me try to break it into two specific things, I think, for people that are actionable. The first is I want to give an example of how actors in the startup community or in the entrepreneurial ecosystem can have things that are their motivation, their goal, that are not necessarily in line of helping entrepreneurs succeed. So in line with the goal of the startup community. And I'll give an example of a positive thing, but that creates some misalignment. And then I'll do a separate rant on sort of the question around hierarchies. The example I'll use actually relates back to Martin's new book, More Good Jobs, which if people have not read yet, I strongly encourage. I wrote the foreword for it. I've known Martin since the early 1990s when we both met as young entrepreneurs working early in both of our first companies, and developed a really long friendship. And jobs is a particularly interesting thing in the context of current environment, with just a massive amount of job loss that has happened, not just job loss, but company extermination because of the COVID crisis. But it's often a thing that in the context of startup communities is very challenging for other actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, especially government, to understand. So here's the example. I've met with many city, state, and federal governments in the U.S. and also around the world at national governments as well as state and local governments and state equivalent and local governments in different countries. Whenever I meet with people who are doing things around entrepreneurship, there's usually a person in the room who's in charge of economic development. And every city that I've ever been to has a person whose job is economic development. And every country that I've ever been involved in has whole organizations around economic development, economic growth, and job creation. If you ask that person what their goals are, okay, hello, Mrs. Economic Development person, what are your goals? One of those goals, invariably near the top, is to create jobs. That's it, create jobs. My goal is to create, KPI number 2 is how many jobs did we create this year? If you go to an entrepreneur and say, hi, I am here to help you, entrepreneur, create jobs, the entrepreneur looks at you and says, that's what my company does. If my company is successful, I create jobs. I don't need your help creating jobs. I need your help doing a bunch of other things so that I can create those jobs. I need help training talent, attracting talent, incenting people to move here. I need help having visibility to employ that talent. I need, regulatory relief so that it's not a burden on my small company that's growing quickly. To hire and retain these people, but I actually don't need your help, quote, creating jobs. So it's subtle. It's a good goal of economic development. But if your goal as somebody in economic development is to help entrepreneurs succeed, it comes back to the very powerful thing that actors can do. And we learn it as entrepreneurs all day long, is talk to your customer. Like, go ask your customer, what do they need, versus start with the precondition that you know what they need. That's a very important thing. It comes through in the book in lots of different ways, but that's an example that seems to, I've used several times recently, it seems to land with people because it's a good thing to create more jobs. But the dynamics of sort of how that's done is often missed by actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. The other part of your question, which is kind of related but kind of unrelated, is around hierarchies. And the reason that this exists, this challenge between the actors in the startup community or the entrepreneurial ecosystem and then the entrepreneurs themselves, is that many of the actors' organizations run on hierarchies. They're hierarchical organizations. There's a boss. People report to the boss, people report to those people. And in a hierarchy, whether you're in government or university or large businesses, although in government we have these things called elections that also change government dynamics. But generally speaking, in a hierarchy, there's 2 ways to move up the hierarchy. There's 2 ways to get more power. One way is to do an awesome job at whatever your job is and whatever your goals in the organizations are and subscribe to the cultural norms of that organization and get promoted. The other way to move up a hierarchy is to undermine the person that you report to, get them fired, and then get a battlefield promotion into their role. Those are kind of the 2 ways that you move up a hierarchy and gain more power. And as people move up hierarchies, they tend to try to consolidate their power. And then when they move from organization to organization, they tend to move from organization to organization to the same place in the hierarchy, or possibly even one level up in the hierarchy. That's not how startup communities work, and that's not how entrepreneur companies work. They run as networks. And networks are situations where each person is a node on the network. And the way you get more power is not by having more connections, the way Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn try to program us to believe that if we just have more friends, we're more powerful. It's actually the number of connections that we have times the value of the information that travels across those connections. And I'm making this point because I'm going to come back to it at the end. It's incredibly important. But the example here would be is in a network, if I have a ton of connections, but the value of the information that travels across those connections is very low, I'm of very little use to that network. If I only have a few connections, but the value of the information across those connections is extremely high, I'm still of very little value to the network. It's the number of connections times the value of the information that travels across the connections. That's how you gain more power. That's how your node on the network gets bigger. I believe very, very strongly that the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2010 was the moment where the importance of hierarchies and networks in our global society shifted. Up to 2008, hierarchies dominated. And I think after 2010, networks became more important. If you read things like Nicholas Taleb, you read things like Antifragile, if you understand how the internet works and how the internet is so anti-fragile, especially in this COVID crisis, where we were able to move all of global society to work from home, that were office workers, in a moment where I think people said culturally we couldn't do it, there's no way we could do it and the technology wouldn't support it, but yet here we are. These are the phenomena of networks that are distributed versus hierarchies. Now, the reason I rant is I think the COVID crisis is accelerating this. So I think we just accelerated 5 years in the last 9 months. We have, in the US, we have a healthcare crisis that's getting worse, not better. If people are thinking about going places or having big Thanksgiving events, please reconsider it, because we're in a very dangerous place in this crisis again. We have an economic crisis that's unabated and has also generated massive inequity between companies that are benefiting from the COVID crisis and companies that are in incredible stress or vanishing, entire segments of industry vanishing. We have a mental health crisis. This is not how, as human beings, we live in boxes on screens. Like, that's not what we're used to. And even more powerfully around the mental health crisis, there was starting to be research about the long-term effects of the disease, and people who have actually had COVID have a much higher percentage of mental health issues downstream after recovering from the disease than not. Starting to come out scientific studies, there's enough time passing. So the mental health crisis that we've had in the US for a long time has been amplified. And of course, we have a huge amplification of a racial equity crisis that we've had since the inception of our country. These crises are all complex systems that are interrelated. They're all the acceleration of what was already happening over a period of time, but we've accelerated that a lot. We are nowhere near resolution on it. We're in a place where many incumbent dynamics are under extraordinary stress, and a number of them are collapsing. A number of those incumbent dynamics are the inhibitors of real change on dimensions of equity, whether it be racial or gender or other. There are real resistance to shifts from hierarchical models to network-based models. And to tie that to startup communities to end with, it reinforces the incredible importance of focusing on the interaction between the parts, not the parts themselves. Counting the number of companies funded, counting the number of entrepreneurs, counting the number of jobs created, counting the number of this, counting the number of that, parts. Okay, it's kind of interesting, but that's not the powerful thing in terms of the complex system. The complex system is the interaction between the parts. It's the value, the multiple of the number of connections times the value, these very difficult things to measure. And just to put an exclamation point on that, if you're an economic development person and you spent the last 5 years of your life on small business and job creation and small business in your city, you did not have built into any of your plans the economic crisis that resulted from COVID, nor the lockdowns that resulted from COVID, nor the massive job loss that resulted from COVID. And again, if you're just measuring numbers, you don't really have any ability to change what's going on. But if you're thinking about what's actually happening and you're focusing on those interactions, then you can start to change things in a profound way.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I think you covered a lot of.
You said 3-minute answers, but that you gave me a rant. I couldn't help.
But you're going right along the path we were hoping you would. So all is well. I think you really addressed this issue very well in your chapter on the myth of quantity, and then you go beyond that because if I were to paraphrase it, hierarchy requires reporting, and reporting often focuses on certain things that are important to the organization and the entity, and that drives that. and I think it's not just government, it's also the way foundations fund things. It's also, lots of different issues go into that.
Military hierarchy, religion's a hierarchy, large companies are hierarchies. I just want to make a quick point before you ask the question, just so people can relate to it. In the Industrial Revolution, if you study management theory going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, sort of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and sort of the peak of management theory around that time, which was at GM with Alfred Sloan, the reason hierarchies were put into place in business was to manage labor. And it was to manage labor because of the massive inefficiencies in communication in 1920. In 2020, we have a completely different infrastructure for communication and managing communication. And so the hierarchy to manage labor is so radically different today, and the needs and the dynamics around how that communication works is so different than 100 years ago. And yet many organizational structures have not caught up with that. Interestingly, startup communities and entrepreneurship generally has. And even in very large entrepreneurial companies, you see many of these characteristics. You see some hierarchical activity in these very large technology companies, but you still see enormous network phenomena. And again, just another contemporary example, think of the number of companies that are in the middle of a distributed or remote work motion and how effectively that has worked for them against the contrast of companies that really struggle and buckle under that because of the way that they are used to communicating and being organized. And the difference is network-based organizations are very adaptive, hierarchical-based organizations are not. Okay, back to your question. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think what we're looking at is this need to also not just look at simple things like cause and effect, right? That's a big point that you make, because it's not easy to identify that, and that requires this new concept for many people of systems thinking, right? So I'm a big fan of Peter Senge too, and I think he was the one who kind of opened up my eyes to thinking about things. How do you how do you solve this issue of trying to help entrepreneurs, which is the ultimate goal, and apply systems thinking towards it?
Well, it's a big part of why we wrote the book, and people who are fascinated by this and want a good sort of quick sort of dip your toe into it. Other than our book, Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, is one of the important books that lots of this was built off of. And the interesting dynamic here, and I want to focus on cause and effect. We human beings want things to be predictable. We want to know that if we do A, B happens. We want things to be lines. We want the steady progression of positive progress. And when there's negative things going on, like we kind of don't really know how to categorize those. There's a cliche that we hear over and over again. I'm sure people hear it all the time or possibly use it, which is this causation or correlation? Did these two things happen because A caused B, or are they just correlated that A and B happened sort of simultaneously? Mm-hmm. That is a really challenging way to analyze anything because it assumes linear and deterministic outcomes. You go back to the starting point with complex systems. With complex systems, especially adaptive ones that change based on what the outputs are, it's very, very hard to narrow into cause and effect. Mm-hmm. A lot of investors have playbooks. This has emerged in the B2B SaaS market, which has become a very well understood sort of business category in the last 10 years. And you'll hear investors show up and say, well, if you just follow the B2B SaaS playbook, you can build a really successful business. And my question on that is, well, if that's true, why are there so many failed B2B SaaS businesses? Because the playbook's helpful. It gives you a guide. It gives you ideas. It gives you things that you can do. But you still have to run experiments. And anything that you're doing as an entrepreneur is a continual series of small experiments, many of which fail. And when an experiment fails, you learn from it and run another experiment. And when the experiment works, you do more of it. And the great entrepreneurs continually run experiments. By the way, I think the great leaders, whether they're entrepreneurial or not, are doing the same. And really, innovation comes from this mindset. In entrepreneurial theory, I think that came from really the origin for me is Steve Blank with customer-driven development, and then Eric Ries with the lean startup and sort of the concepts around that, of which a lot of the startup community and startup community way notions are built on. But it comes back to the fundamental question, which is if you want to help entrepreneurs succeed, you have to try a lot of things. And you have to be willing to have a lot of things not work. And when they don't work, you have to learn from them and try again, built on what you learn, rather than say, okay, this is the playbook, this is the script. Now we're going to apply this playbook over this period of time. And as long as we just do sequences in this order, A, B, C, D, E, good things will happen. It's just not how it works.
Yeah. Well, amazing stuff. So thank you so much. We have a little under 5 minutes left, and I want to ask one quick sort of lightning question, and then I'll see if we can get to at least one of our audience questions. So a good chunk of our audience today is entrepreneurs, and all of them, as you can imagine, spend most of their time heads down building their business, right? And then there are people like Martin and me and others who are saying, well, how can you be more, why aren't you more involved? Or how can you be more involved? What's your advice to those entrepreneurs? They obviously care about their community. They're choosing to build their businesses here. What's your message for those people who are busy building their business about how engagement with the community?
Super important question. Allocate 10 to 20% of your time as a leader doing things in your startup community that are helpful to your business. You don't have to be altruistic. You don't have to be selfless. And for somebody who says, well, I don't know what that is, like, how could my startup community help me? I'll give an example. And it's one of my favorite examples from a long time ago. I had an entrepreneur who had a business that was ramping say, I don't have time. I'm spending so much time on my business. I just don't have time for that shit. I said, what's the biggest problem you have? I can't find enough iOS developers, this person said. I'm dying. If I could find more iOS developers, we could grow twice as fast. I said, all right, well, why don't you start an iOS meetup, serve pizza each month, and just invite iOS developers and have your team of iOS developers lead content and see what happens. And let's talk in a year. And we talk more frequently than that. And I gave him a little bit more. It's lightning round, so I can't give you the whole spiel, but that was the thing. He said, all right, I'll try it. I buy it. I'll try it. A year later, he had one of the fastest growing companies in Colorado. And we sat down. I said, so how did that go for you? He said, fucking unbelievable. We have lots and lots of iOS developers that don't work for us who are helping us figure out things. We built this community of iOS developers, and we've lost a couple of people to some other startup or something. We're probably going to lose them anyway, but the number of people we've gotten as a result of doing this, and the idea that my company now is the one that everybody points at and says, if you're an iOS developer, you've got to get connected to these folks, it's made us the center of that world. Very specific thing. It was hugely additive at the time to the Boulder startup community because iOS was just really starting to ramp. This was 2011 or 12. And something to use over and over again. You can apply that anyway. If you're an entrepreneur, what are your top 3 biggest problems? And if the answer is I need more money, okay, that's fine. Give me your next 3 biggest problems. Pick one of them and commit 10% of your time to doing something in the startup community that addresses that problem.
Yep. So thank you. And then I'm going to go into we got some questions. And Michael Thaney, who runs our Startup Grind program here in Rochester, New York, asked, for the startup community, obviously our primary purpose is to help entrepreneurs succeed. What is the one thing everyone here attending today should think about doing to go out and help a startup succeed? We have lots and lots of people, and what's the one thing that you would or how should they go about thinking about it?
I'm going to give you a philosophy rather than a tactic. The philosophy is positive sum game. Think of it as not a zero sum game where there's winners or losers, like sports, and I guess there's ties and things like soccer and hockey. But at the end of the season, there's a winner and a loser. In a presidential election, there's a winner and there's a loser. In your startup community, there isn't a winner and a loser. It's a positive sum game. Many companies can benefit from each other's success. So use that attitude of a positive sum game in everything that you do in the context of your startup community and your fellow entrepreneurs.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. And on behalf of all of our community, we really look forward to having you visit us again once the COVID pandemic is over. And thank you for so generously sharing your time and wisdom with us.
Someday again, I expect I'll be sleeping in the guest bedroom at Martin's house in Little Falls.
Very much so. We look forward to it.